Ladies and gentlemen, you're watching TVP World. From the front lines to the backstage, we bring you the latest from Ukraine this week. I'm your host, Benjamin Lee, and let's get rolling. US President Donald Trump is still hopeful about peace talks with Ukraine, despite President Zelensky rejecting a proposed plan that would recognize Russia's occupation of Crimea and include other concessions. Meanwhile, on April 24th, Russia launched one of the deadliest strikes on Kyiv, killing at least 12 people and injuring 90 more. This latest escalation follows a violation of the Easter ceasefire announced by Vladimir Putin. Russian forces carried out more than 3,000 attacks across multiple regions. Now, to discuss these and other significant developments in Ukraine, we will be joined today by Mark Toth, a U.S. security and foreign policy expert. But first, let's take a look at the key events and highlights from Ukraine over the past week.
On the night of April 24, 2025, Russia launched a massive missile and drone attack on Kyiv, killing at least 12 civilians and wounding 90 others, including 6 children. This strike marked the deadliest attack on the Ukrainian capital since July 2024. The barrage, lasting approximately 11 hours, involved 66 missiles and 145 drones, targeting multiple neighborhoods, causing extensive damage to residential buildings and infrastructure. President Zelensky later confirmed that the missile that claimed those 12 lives was supplied by North Korea. In response to the attack, US President Donald Trump issued a rare public rebuke to Russian President Vladimir Putin, urging him to stop and emphasizing the urgency of securing a ceasefire. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, who was on an official trip to South Africa, cut his trip short to return to Kyiv amid the tragedy. Aside from Kyiv, the northeastern city of Kharkiv was also targeted, with at least 7 missiles fired at the city, causing further destruction and civilian casualties. Russia's relentless attacks continued elsewhere in Ukraine. A Russian drone hit a bus carrying workers in the Ukrainian city of Marhanets on Wednesday, killing 9 people and wounding close to 50. Another drone attack occurred in Pavlohrad in the Dnipropetrovsk region on Friday, killing 3 people, including a child, and wounding at least 10 others. As expected, the ceasefire over Easter announced by Vladimir Putin quickly turned out to be a blatant lie. Russian forces carried out more than 3,000 violations of the ceasefire along the front line, launching various attacks across Ukrainian regions. On April 22nd, a Russian missile strike killed 1 person and wounded 23 others, including 3 children, in the city of Zaporizhia. Russian missiles in Kharkiv wounded 8 civilians, including an elderly couple, as the weapons struck residential buildings and marketplaces. A Russian drone attack targeted a funeral procession in the Kherson region, wounding 4 and damaging a local hospital. On Easter Monday, Russian drones struck Odessa, wounding 3 people and damaging residential buildings and civilian infrastructure. A proposed US peace plan aiming to stop the war in Ukraine has sparked significant backlash. The plan suggests freezing the current front lines, recognizing Russian control over Crimea, and barring Ukraine from joining NATO. In return, Ukraine would receive security guarantees from European nations and financial aid for reconstruction. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has firmly rejected the proposal.
Ukraine will not legally recognize the occupation of Crimea. This is a matter of principle enshrined in our constitution.
The Trump administration has warned that it may withdraw from mediation efforts if no progress is made. President Zelensky reminded the US president that the Secretary of State from Trump's first term in office, Mike Pompeo, declared non-recognition of Crimea as Russian back in 2018. French Foreign Minister Jean-Noël Barrot expressed skepticism about the feasibility of a peace deal throughout the week, citing unpredictable actions from Russia. The meeting between European and US officials in London was ultimately downgraded to a ministerial level, as Marco Rubio was a no-show.
Now is Mark Toth, national security analyst and military affairs commentator. With deep expertise in defense strategy and global conflict, Mr. Toth offers us insight into the evolving geopolitical chessboard shaping Ukraine's fight for sovereignty. Hello, sir, and welcome to TVP World.
Benjamin, great to see you. Thank you.
So today we are examining, of course, all things Ukraine. I would like to start with the most recent strike conducted by Russia. What do you think is the goal behind the latest mass attack on Kyiv? Do you think that's more of an escalation or a pressuring during the talks?
Ben, candidly, it's just more the same from Putin. Every time that he gets into so-called negotiations with the Trump administration and they come to some kind of agreement or some kind of disagreement, Putin, regardless, follows it up with attack on Ukrainian civilian sites. We've seen this time and time again. What's different this time, though, is it comes in light of Putin basically saying, look, I'm attacking Ukrainian civilian sites. They deserve it. They're supporting a regime that's working against Russia and our interests in terms of what they want out of Ukraine. And it's just tragically more of the same weaponization of war, but using civilians as targets. If I'm Trump, I should be interpreting this as a middle finger, essentially, to me, saying that Putin doesn't really respect you, doesn't respect the peace process that you and Rubio are trying to effect, that you were trying to make happen in London, and that he's trying to have it both ways. He's basically and essentially saying Russia is controlling the pace of negotiations, Russia's controlling the war in Ukraine, and Russia, in effect, is controlling Trump himself and his team when it comes to the negotiation process. And these attacks are simply a reminder of all of that, to say, I'm in control, you're not. You can't tell me what to do. I'm going to keep doing it, which in this case, sadly, is murdering innocent Ukrainian civilians.
All right, like you mentioned here, Putin did kind of admit to attacking the civilian infrastructure and causing the deaths that we just saw on screen. And throughout this whole negotiation process involving the U.S. administration, we've seen the Trump team from believing that Putin is discussing in goodwill to, I think, eventually realizing a bit late that Putin doesn't really want the so-called peace deal to take place. Now, Trump has made this publicly rebuked and basically telling Putin to stop. But do you think that any stronger action will be taking place anytime soon?
Benjamin, unfortunately, I just view it as more as the same kabuki theater that we've been seeing out of Trump. When it goes too far, when the images get too graphic of people, whether it was in Kyiv and the little mother clinging to a girl that both just nearly escaped death but were still bloodied, when it came to the older people being pulled from the wreckage in the recent strikes over the weekend and in this last week, Trump felt compelled to say something. But I'm not sure that it really is impacting his calculus. Everything else still seems geared towards trying to dictate these peace terms on a very ill-advised peace plan that Trump has been floating that basically concedes everything to Russia, with Ukraine gaining nothing. So unfortunately, as much as I want to believe that Trump, when he says stop, means something, unfortunately, his word stop is about as effective as what Biden was during his administration, whether it was talking to Hamas, Iran, or even Russia, when he said don't. They basically mean the same thing, which is nothing. Putin has no intention of stopping, whether Trump tells him to stop or not.
Right, so of course these words perhaps don't weigh as much as a lot of people hope to be. Now, taking this perspective of Trump's personal ego, though, like you mentioned, this can be seen pretty much as Putin flipping him the bird. Do you think that from that aspect it might provoke Trump into actually taking some sort of action, seeing that even if he doesn't really have Ukraine's interests in mind, perhaps his personal image and kind of his own interests might compel him to do something?
Benjamin, you would think, I mean, your rationale is exactly right. That's what someone would normally do, basically saying, hey, if the other side that I'm negotiating with is negotiating in bad faith and is going a step further, is taking active steps to undermine that, you'd certainly say, hey, I'm going to push back. I'm not going to keep taking this. But time and time again, we see Trump continuing to basically ignore these signals, his messaging, if you will, that's coming from Moscow and ignoring it. Just not a good look whatsoever. And yet, conversely, when it comes to Ukraine, if there's the slightest sense that Ukraine is embarrassing Trump, for instance, Trump just in the last few days had tweeted about on X, a article in the Wall Street Journal that Zelensky had done, saying, look, this isn't helpful, and he was attacking Zelensky once again, Ukraine feels the full weight of Trump's ire. So it's, and then if we look for demonstrative steps to see whether Trump's changing his calculus or not, he doesn't appear to, because you've got Steve Witkoff meeting once again with Putin and getting there basically to this effect that I'm paraphrasing. He said he's glad to be back in Moscow. You know, is any caring Christian type, you know, or any decent religion that's out there type person would think, how can you arrive in a country and say it's great to be back when you know that this country's caused 1 million or more casualties, people dying on both sides, being wounded on both sides, and are almost daily attacking Ukrainian civilians, many of them children, killing many of those children. I don't know how there's anything great about that. It's disgusting. It's immoral behavior. And yet we just don't see the Trump administration getting there yet. We're still trying to act as though Russia is a friend, when in fact Russia is an enemy of liberty, an enemy of Europe, and I would argue, whether Trump sees it or not, absolutely an enemy of the United States.
Right, and perhaps having the strike taking place under his watch essentially might hurt his credibility a little bit. And when it comes to credibility, I'm also curious about Trump floating the idea of recognizing Crimea. Do you think that that in and of itself would also kind of diminish U.S.'s credibility as a peace broker?
Absolutely, Ben. I mean, it's foolish for him to do that. As General Hodges has said, I believe on your program and many times on TVP World, Crimea is the decisive terrain of this war. And frankly, it's the decisive terrain, strategically speaking, of Eastern Europe for decades to come. And simply to concede that, to say that somehow in violation of international law, just simply because Russia invaded and controls it, that Ukraine has to cede that territory, is not helpful to anything. It just further undermines the credibility of Trump as being an honest broker. And rightly, I saw today where the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry came out with 3 points, and one of those points that they said in terms of any future negotiations is they're not going to recognize Russian sovereignty over any of the 5 regions that Putin wants, including Crimea. And that's the appropriate step to take. So in terms of U.S. credibility, Trump needs to change. My writing partner, Colonel John Sweet, and I have written both at the Hill in Washington, D.C. this week, as well as the Kyiv Post in Kyiv, saying, look, this plan of appeasement, if you will, that Trump is trying to push on Ukraine, push on Europe too, and frankly, push on to Poland, something for your viewers to be concerned about, is not, it's inane. It's just ridiculous. It's not helping his credibility. It's not helping U.S. credibility. And it's not, in a long-term sense, helping the security and safety of Europe overall.
And when it comes to the point of Crimea, there's a lot of contentious topics, and I would like to play the devil's advocate a little bit, bring out some of the arguments on the side that are talking about recognizing Crimea, and if you can help me kind of dispel some of these talking points. Now, some people are saying that Crimea was taken back in 2014 without essentially firing a shot, and Ukraine didn't really demonstrate that they have any attempt at taking it back. So kind of bringing it back to the negotiation table right now essentially is asking for more than it can realistically expect to take back. Do you think that there are any merits to that?
No. I mean, in a simple word, no. Because, look, if international law is to mean anything, no country should be allowed, and that includes the United States, should be allowed to invade another country for territorial conquest and keep it. It's a violation on so many different levels. For instance, Russia is a permanent member of the UN Security Council. They have an obligation under the UN Charter to make sure that these kind of actions don't happen by any country, let alone themselves. And yet here they are doing it, simply because Ukraine wasn't in a position to defend itself in 2014 and was forced, in effect, to take a peace deal because their military wasn't developed enough. They didn't have enough capabilities. They didn't have the right weapon systems to deter against this. And the U.S., with Obama then as president, wasn't giving enough backing for them to even come close to achieving that. Is no reason why Ukraine should be forced today. They've not given up any rights. There's no point in international law that it has a basis for Russia claiming simply because, or for others to claim that simply because they couldn't defend Crimea in 2014, that now that they've been attacked again, that they shouldn't be doing so in 2025. Now, I will say, yes, taking back Crimea is a challenging thing. It can be done if Europe and the U.S., or one of those, especially the U.S., but Europe as well. If Europe is willing to back Ukraine they still militarily can. You have a badly mauled Russian army. Yes, they're replacing tanks. Yes, they're replacing armored personnel carriers, et cetera. But it takes a long cycle to train soldiers, command and control structures, all the officers, the NCOs that have been killed over the last couple of years. You don't replace that. In the U.S., those take 10 to 20 years to develop those officers. You just can't do that in a short curve and expect to come up. There are many advantages that Ukraine has. They just need more technological support. They need these Taurus missiles, the 140 or so that Friedrich Merz is claiming that he's willing to send. He needs Europe to step it up. A no-fly zone, for instance, the Sky Shield concept for Western Ukraine, that they would patrol the skies, would do enormous good for Ukraine. They could push their defensive assets, air assets forward into the battlefields that are being forced right now to protect Ukrainian civilians. There's a lot they can do. Europe can make it clear, and that backtrack has just been some reports that UK is potentially doing in terms of saying, yes, we are going to put European peacekeeping troops along any demilitarized zone in the future. There's a lot that can be doing, and there's a lot that can get Crimea back on the table and back in play in terms of who ultimately controls it. And I'll make one last quick point here. The reason why going forward it's so critical is who controls Crimea, and in many ways is going to who controls the shipping lanes in the Black Sea. Russia would be further positioned off to the east. And a key thing, the rare earth minerals deal, the grain shipments, Ukraine being a food basket, all of those transit the Black Sea through the straits in Turkey, into the Mediterranean and around the world. If you leave that to Russia, then they're always going to control that. They can always strangle Ukraine economically, and it would leave them intact with this land bridge as well from Crimea to attack Odessa in the future, which in my mind is clearly what Putin is intending to do at some point.
Right, and Crimea, of course, is also very strategically important as well for the European Union. If it's indeed being recognized as Russian, that could threaten the Union as well. Do you think that might be enough for Europe to step up its backing for Ukraine, or is there a world where we might actually see European boots on the ground in order for this to actually happen?
Ben, I do think it's a major threat. Several months ago, I did write an article where we talked about Ukraine being Europe's red thin line. It really is the start of Eastern Europe's line of defense. And to concede that, to allow Russia to continue to control Crimea, simply ultimately endangers Odessa. Eventually, it would endanger Moldova again, which is trying to join the EU. And it would threaten Romania. It would also create a new pressure point, in addition from Belarus, that would be threatening Poland and the Baltic states. Nothing good comes from it. Russia needs to be pushed back into its own territory. It can't be rewarded with other territory. In my opinion, and I say this as an American, an embarrassed American, I can't think of a worse strategic policy than what Trump is doing now in terms of arguing that somehow Crimea should remain Russian or under Russian control and be recognized as such. The only thing that could be worse than that is if Europe itself agrees to that. And I think there are signs that they're not willing to do that. The fact that this conference several days ago broke up, not just because the Secretary of State Marco Rubio pulled out when Ukraine said we can't agree to some of this, so did the European foreign minister. So I think it's highly critical that Europe says, look, our red line is Crimea as well. We can't agree to this. If you do agree to it, I do think, and I hate the World War II analogies, but I do think you can look at it like Czechoslovakia and Austria, the things that led to the invasion of Poland that your country knows all too well happens when you don't stand up to someone that's trying to seize your territory by military force.
Now, speaking of the EU, I'm also here examining the EU-Ukraine proposal. Now, on their version of a peace plan, it involves security guarantees from Washington, as well as no negotiation on any sort of territorial concession until at least a ceasefire is reached. Now, these all sound very good on paper, and I think former UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson's critique for the US version of the peace plan offering nothing to Ukraine is quite sound as well. But realistically, seeing that the US administration is essentially already threatening to walk out, do you think that the EU demanding Washington give Ukraine any sort of security guarantee is actually something feasible?
Yeah, I don't. The only way that Ukraine is going to get some kind of security guarantee from the U.S. during the Trump administration is going to be in the nature of an economic one. The idea that if they do this REM deal, the rare earth minerals deal, the U.S. would defend its interests. I'm not sure that I buy into that. Trump doesn't seem that invested in protecting it. I really do believe that it falls to Europe. And so in this regard, look, if Trump does walk away, maybe, and this is tragic. There's nothing good about this in my mind as an American, because I believe this is exactly opposite of how our country should be reacting. But if the U.S. does walk away from it in terms of what it's demanding of Ukraine and giving up, and in terms of this, outrageous, this crazy conceding of everything that Putin wants to Putin, Ukraine and Europe might be better off. It might force Europe to say, look, we have to defend this on our own. Washington is letting us down collectively. And there are options for security guarantees. Both the UK and France have nuclear capabilities. You can back it up with teeth. You certainly have the air assets as the European partners of NATO to be able to do no-fly zones. And you have the military training and troop strength to be able to deploy soldiers along demilitarized zones.
Right. Now, of course, a lot of emphasis is put on the EU actually supporting Ukraine and stepping up, taking more responsibility. I'm also looking at the same proposal aforementioned, mentioning that Washington being the one that provides the security guarantee. And looking into it, I can't help but think that there's still some reluctancy when it comes to having the political will to actually carrying this thing out and seeing things through. Do you think that this might be just like a first attempt at trying to goad the Americans into doing something before Europe have to step up? Or do you think this also signal perhaps some sort of uncertainty when it comes to whether or not Europe can really kind of step into those shoes?
Ben, your characterization of this as uncertain is probably the best way to look at it. Europe is probably, in my opinion, cautiously trying to explore if there's a way to yet retrieve the position with the Trump administration, convince them that a security guarantee is there. There are cards to be played there. When Keir Starmer met with Trump a month or so back at the White House, when pressed, President Trump said, look, we've always backed Britain and we would back them again. And that he was inferring that if Britain acted as peacekeepers in Ukraine, the U.S. would have their back militarily. So the auspices for that is there. I think the other cards that can be effectively played is Trump soon, again, a little bit distant, but in September, he's supposed to have a state visit to the UK where we'll be spending time with King Charles. And that's another opportunity for Europe, in effect, and King Charles taking the lead to convince Trump that can't abandon Europe, and hopefully that happens. The question now for us, though, is this interim period between April and we're almost in May, but between April and September, how we can get Trump to change. I just don't know that it happens. And in my opinion, I think the best way forward is for Europe to start showing true leadership now. Don't wait for the U.S. You set the pace. You set the agenda. You set the terms. And stop looking to Washington to solve this. You have every right to. I'm not criticizing that approach. You should be able to, as the U.S. is a NATO ally, as a leading NATO ally. But right now, the Trump administration is letting you down and is favoring Putin and their side of this argument. So it's just incumbent, and again, apologize for repeating myself, but the point is important to underscore. It's time, it's critical for Europe to step up and say, this isn't going to stand. This is our red line. We're not going to give Putin a win, if you will, in Ukraine, because ultimately that would turn into a loss for us as Europe.
And thank you so much for bringing us your input and insight. Really appreciate it. And thanks for being with us on Ukraine This Week.
Great. Benjamin, always a pleasure to talk with you. Thank you.
And that's all on this episode of Ukraine This Week. Tune back into TVP World, same time, same place, only on TVP World.